The idea of this, I'm going to have a chat here with Matt, who you'll have seen previously. I mean, obviously you've appeared twice, I think, in videos I've made at Hack Green talking about
yeah, twice.
Yes, which has been very interesting. So as that's not possible at the moment due to the fact that it's literally nothing going on in terms of reenacting for obvious reasons, but it might be worth having a little chat over Skype. So it's just me on webcam, because Matt doesn't have a webcam at present, but nevertheless, I thought it'd be good to have a bit of a chat about Cold War stuff.
Absolutely.
All sorts of bits and pieces. If you're wherever the conversation goes in terms of military kit and stuff, I'm sure it'll be interesting. So I think would it be fair to say, Matt, that your sort of focus is Soviet kit, or do you I'm not sure, do you cover other?
It's pretty much entirely Soviet, yeah. And by Soviet I mean specifically the sort of actual USSR as opposed to the Warsaw Pact.
Yes, of course, yeah.
I was going to try and branch out into sort of equivalent British gear from the same sort of period, but it was just, I haven't got a lot of space, and it's quite an expense to run two sort of parallel lines.
It is, yeah. Yes, it is. Though I have to say that I think because you've focused, your collection of Soviet kit and everything is very interesting and representative from the stuff we've seen at the events. It's been very it's very interesting when someone has such a good collection. You can actually look at and you have a lot of answers of course as well for various questions. But it means you've got a chance to put on a very good display, which is useful. And it's always interesting. I think when we've talked previously of sort of contrasting the attitude of the two different sides. Yeah. So it's nice to be able to do that. And as I don't really collect a little bit of East German stuff, it's very useful and very helpful having you around and other people who collect that side of things to talk to at events and things and show a little bit of that side of things. So
one tries.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I suppose in terms of reenacting and so on, obviously collecting itself is for the interest of the kit and everything. What did you come to reenacting? So did you start reenacting first and wearing the kit, or did you start collecting first, or how did you get into the hobby? I guess
it started off collecting, and then I sort of realised I've got all this stuff, and it's not like collecting, models or action figures or whatever. You can't really do anything with it unless you're displaying it or reenacting in it.
That's true.
And it started off as a way of getting some use out of all the stuff I'd got. The first uniform I got was an M88 with a 6B3 vest, and it's fairly expensive stuff, and I didn't want it just sitting in a box for all eternity and doing nothing. So it started like that, and it sort of went from there. And then it became a way of sort of engaging with people. I've used the phrase before, and I don't know whether it's right, a sort of living mannequin.
Yes.
Sounds a little bit odd, but, a mannequin with a uniform on, people can look at it and go, oh, yeah, it's very nice. What is it? The mannequin can't go, oh, it's X. I can.
Absolutely,
It's just, that's the way I look at it. It's a way of, a little living exhibit. Is a way of putting it. I quite like that.
Good way of doing things, and a good way of sort of describing it, very much so. And why Soviet, I suppose, is another question. Why?
It might sound a little bit crass, but it started off as an aesthetic thing.
Right, okay, no, you have to like things you collect.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I'd started off, obviously always been interested in history, was very, very much into the Second World War during sort of high school and just afterwards. And it was only sort of, we never really covered the Cold War very well at school. So
nor did we.
No. I don't think many do. But I just sort of rolled into that, and I was just looking at, reference materials and thinking, these guys why are they all wearing really old looking uniforms? And then I sort of looked from that, and then, it's actually modern uniforms of the period, and then compare it to the Western stuff and just thinking, what is going on? And it just sort of went from there.
It's something we've discussed, haven't we? I think the last event at Hack Green, the fact they're wearing essentially what you would consider in Western terms to almost be a parade uniform or number 2 uniform, and it's actually their field uniform, which
when you look into it, it is a fully functional field. And there were specific dress uniforms and parade uniforms.
Yes, indeed.
But the actual field uniform looks really quite dressy, and it's just.
And it's interesting you have that difference in thinking between West and East in terms of that greater delineation between what's worn in the field and what's worn in the, and you're sort of blurred lines a little bit with sort of the MVA in East Germany wearing a field combat uniform essentially, but still quite specific to their thinking. Originally just worn over the dress uniform and so forth. So it is interesting, the different mentalities. I think that's one reason I like talking to people who collect the other side as well. Obviously, my primary focus is British and Commonwealth, but it's interesting looking at the different doctrines, not only from a tactical point of view, but also from everything from the small arms, the uniform and so forth, and how they would be used, and the image that was trying to be conveyed. Because obviously your forces are not only, particularly I think from a Soviet point of view, the forces are not only a military presence in the field, there's obviously a huge amount of propaganda.
I mean, particularly from the sort of operations in operation manoeuvres and things in East Germany. There's a huge emphasis. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the Soviet soldiers from the 70s and the early 80s with the bright red shoulder boards, collar tabs. They're really, really fancy. That is specifically not quote unquote wartime gear. In wartime, those bright pads had come off, the bright shoulder pads had come off, and you'd have much more muted insignia.
Yes.
So it was sort of.
Did they produce flexing? Did they produce subdued versions of that insignia then, or would it just remove? Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
It exists, and it's literally a case of before you go out into the field or on the way out, you take the old boards off, literally cut them off, cut the threads, sew the new ones on, off you go. But obviously for field manoeuvres, training, practicing.
Yeah, of course. Not bothersome.
If the cameras are going to be there, we might as well put the fancy stuff on.
A benefit, yes, indeed. Yeah.
So there's this huge emphasis on, we're doing military things, but look how flash we look doing it.
Yes, yes. And I'm sure specific units were chosen for, the propaganda value and so forth.
Very often see the Guards units on the front covers of sort of propaganda magazines and, release photos and stuff like that.
It is interesting, as I say, that they viewed that in the. I think perhaps the mentality would be different here. You'd prefer. I think I'd prefer to see troops in a modern camouflage combat uniform and show their technical proficiency. But obviously, the idea behind the propaganda was very different on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in still showing a dressy.
It's interesting that you talk about the technical side of things. The uniforms you see are quite weird. Like I say, that they're chosen specifically more for propaganda than anything.
Yes.
Because although the image of the Soviet soldier is always in a khaki uniform in the 70s, and everybody else has got camouflage or starting to invest in camouflage and things, there were actually a whole range of had camouflage masking suits. They're technically called masking
indeed.
suits. Really scruffy looking overalls.
Yes.
Worn over the top of the uniform. And of course, they don't appear because they don't fit in with the propaganda line.
Of course, but they did exist and they were around.
They are quite interesting, to be perfectly honest.
This is the green with the sort of the pale, almost sort of pattern.
There's 2 or 3 types, and it gets quite interesting because they fit different roles. There's the traditional masking suits had been around since the Second World War and were for sort of recon troops, marksmen, specialists who needed to stay hidden and were a little bit more, I don't want to say it less, but a little more valuable than your average grunt infantryman. That's a bad way of putting it, but that's the thought. And they continued through. So you get the well-known one is called the KLMK.
Yes. Which
is just it's like a hooded oversuit, camouflage. It's made of a sort of parachute material.
It's very thin, isn't it? Almost a porous, a cellular material almost.
Yes. Yeah. But then the other one that you sometimes see is it's slightly more scruffy looking. It's a very dark, quite washed out looking camouflage suit. And if you look at it up close, it's got almost a Hessian sort of texture to it. And that is very interesting because that is part of the whole range of CBRN kit the Soviets had. So there was a chem suits, the big bright green rubber chem suits, the OZK, which is a chemical suit. Under that was developed a specific uniform that's designed not to catch fire when exposed to a nuclear flash.
Ah, interesting, yes.
He found the M69, the field cotton uniforms, had a bad habit of bursting into flames when exposed to a thermal flash. This is obviously, you're not in the epicenter of the blast because you wouldn't survive anyway.
No, but even at range where you could potentially survive.
But the flash, and obviously your uniform would burn, you'd end up burnt, and you would be combat ineffective because you'd have horrible burns.
Yes.
The undersuit was designed for that. Then there was the chem suit. The chem suit is interesting in, as well as being chemically protective, it actually includes melamine, a small amount of melamine in its material, again to stop it melting or bursting into flames quite as readily. Of course, it's a bright green suit. Yes. You're going to show up. It's not ideal for camouflage purposes. So this sort of Hessian suit is called a KZS. It's a contraction. The Soviets loved contractions, but it roughly stands for protective overalls. And you wear that over the chem suit, and that is an anti-flash suit, similar in concept to the hoods that used to be worn on battleships for the gun crews.
Yeah, the anti-flash gear.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same sort of principle. They were mass producing huge numbers. Those suits. They were fairly disposable. They're not really particularly resilient. They get torn or singed or whatever, you throw them away, get a new one. But they also became very popular as camouflage suits and saw use in Afghanistan, where there was no real threat of being hit by nuclear ordnance.
You certainly hope not, anyway.
Well, yeah. At least I don't think
badly wrong if you're.
Very badly wrong.
Afghanistan, yeah. Which is an interesting topic in itself, which you've covered very well at previous. I think there's I think I've said this in previous videos, is that Vietnam looms large in the mind of the Western military history. But a lot of people seem to forget about, or certainly not pay as much attention to, Afghanistan, which has been described as, obviously it's in no way exactly the same, but you can certainly draw some parallels between Vietnam and what happened to the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And that is an interesting topic. And it was nice to see that covered so well by you guys at the Pat Green previous, 2018, I think.
Yeah, not last year, the year before,
Before, I think, yes, so 2018, yeah.
It's interesting that, like you say, the two climates at the time. I mean, in the 60s, you had the whole counterculture movement, the hippies, the communes, all this, or the anti-war movement. In the Soviet Union, about the same time, you got Mikhail Gorbachev came in the middle of the war, and there's the whole perestroika and glasnost movements.
So there's a similar effect in the Soviet Union from Afghanistan as there was in the US.
You've got lots of people, draftees, conscripts, who we don't really want to do this. This isn't. Why are we over there? We don't know why we're over there. Why?
It was difficult to explain within the narrative, the state narrative, as to exactly why.
We're just doing our internationalist duty. We don't want to. Sort of. It's more complex than that, but like you said, there's so many parallels, and it's really another interesting thing to note about the Afghan conflict from a uniform point of view is how rapidly the propaganda image of the brilliant, smartly dressed new Soviet man with his shoulder boards and his fancy webbing utterly degrades into, we're out here, it's really hot, the uniforms are terrible, we've got bits of uniforms from all over the place, let's just make the best of it. And how it devolves from form into practicality very quickly. Guys start adapting bits of uniforms, or piecing together uniforms that shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
And the regulations just go completely out the window.
Yeah, which would not be tolerated in the Soviet army in any other scenario.
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, we're not going to the extent of GIs in Vietnam with born to kill and short time calendars on the helmets and things, but it's getting that way. It's getting that way.
Yes. And presumably similarly in Vietnam, the longer the war went on, the more you would see that in even units where you might not previously have expected to.
No, absolutely. Even sort of grunt units with very strict sort of oversight, the uniform quality degrades. And
because I think, if I remember correctly, in 2018 I think you had a moustache.
Yes.
You're saying that obviously last year when you were doing very much infantry in Europe in the 70s, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's right.
And they said you might not recognise it because he doesn't have the moustache now, and of course, as you say, not permitted. Was facial hair permitted at all?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I've never really looked into that specific angle. I've not seen a lot of pictures. If it is, it tends to be not conscripts. The conscripts did the 2-year service, and I think it was just shave your tash off, just look as neat as possible.
Yeah.
If you were
all hair above here gone.
Yeah.
My brows. Yeah.
whereas if you were staying in on a slightly more professional basis, if you were, you know, a sergeant, an officer, I think you were given a little bit of leeway so long as it wasn't excessive.
Nice, tidy, yeah, keep yourself looking tidy, and that makes sense. But no, it is interesting how quickly that degrades in combat. Speaking of, if you just give me one moment, I'll just nip away from the computer. Something I plan to bring to Hack Green next time, which I think you'll find interesting. Just give me one moment. Oop. And return. I don't know if you've seen this. I put this, so yeah, I'll probably edit that little bit out with me maneuvering, but I will bring this with me next time if I can get it to.
Recognition handbook. Oh, excellent.
Now, this is quite interesting because, of course, we know far more information now was known at the time. So some of the entries are very uninformative.
Yes.
It's the very bare bones of information, but some of it's quite interesting, and some of the photographs and things are rather good. I'll just try and find a. Let's see if I can find a single entry here. Of course, it's going to be reversed, isn't it? But never mind. Let's see. What have we got? Oh, there was the A. There we go. So this is on the. If I can get this up here.
Oh well, it's not wrong.
And then here we go. So I don't know if. That's the only problem with webcam.
Yeah, I can sort of see it.
I don't know if it's reversed for you, but
no, it's the right way around. It's all good.
So it's quite an interesting read through, and I'll bring it with me next time so you can have a
great to look at.
It's very interesting how little some of the entries say about the kit, particularly newer stuff when this was published, and then now, of course, it's all available on Wikipedia.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is quite amusing, really.
I have a book at home here, a reference book, and looking through it, although it's quite good for certain things. Some of it, you look at it and knowing what we know now, it's just like, this is complete nonsense.
Yes.
You know, there's just factually, why are you saying this? But at the time, nobody knew any better.
Yeah, it was what was known. I think there is I think we look back with sort of 2020 vision on what's now known and forget how little was known in some instances back in the day in terms of basic information about enemy forces and their capabilities and new vehicles and so forth. I mean, obviously a huge amount of effort put in to find out about it, but we know so much more now than was known then.
Absolutely.
About actual strength and so forth. But it's a fascinating subject. So another question for you. How far does your Soviet collection sort of stretch back in terms of time? To the 60s or
the
70s?
Earliest piece of kit I have, I was before the lockdown started, and I sort of reined in my purchasing, not for financial, but because of a lot of it's coming from different places, and I just didn't want to take any chances.
No, it's very sensible.
The earliest stuff I have is a pair of shoulder boards and gymnasturka, which are the sorry, not gymnasturka, that's the shirt. Yeah, I do have a gymnasturka. Almost. Sorry, I need to do a sort out.
Absolutely fine. We're all in. I'm in that boat too. Don't.
Everywhere, bits of it everywhere. I don't even know anymore. I've got about a third of a 1950s uniform.
Oh, very nice.
So the very earliest I go back to is the late 1950s, early 1960s, all the way up to sort of the collapse of the Union in the 90s.
Yes.
So that's about 40 years at the very most. For my collection.
We'll have to do a joint display at some point with the evolution of the British Army of the Rhine and Soviet forces. That could be an interesting one.
GSFG, absolutely.
Yeah, comparison of different types of 50s, 60s, and 70s maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how much the
60s, 70s, 80s maybe. I don't know, but
of course, yeah. Well, I mean, the GSFG were still technically in Germany until the middle of the 90s.
Yes,
the Union had fallen apart, so it was the Russian army then, but they were still there, sort of milling about like, when are we going home? It's all over now, come on. A very slow withdrawal. That'd be a good idea. I mean, I'm not sure how much British and Commonwealth uniforms changed, whether there was as much or there was more granularity than there was with the Soviet uniforms, because the Soviets hung on to uniforms for quite long periods. There wasn't
the big shift you see is the switch from battle dress to combats.
Yep.
Then the next big switch you see is combats in green to combats in DPM.
Yes.
And those are the two rapid things. It's the new uniform, and it's much better for the field when you get combat uniform come in. And then obviously there's a big push to get the camouflage uniform out, particularly to frontline troops. You see in the early 70s, there's footage of tank crew wearing the old green combat uniform and the infantry wearing the new DPM. So there's clearly a push. There was a major push to get the infantry into DPM.
I suppose it's less critical for tank crews since
it is absolutely
they're inside a tank most of the time.
And supporting arms, but there was a really big push to get tank crew excuse me. There's a really big push to get infantry to wear the camouflage uniform, obviously because it's so much better for camouflage and concealment and field craft, and so which was a big part of the doctrine of the British Army in the 1960s, but into the 1970s. I mean, it had been for a long time. If you look at the Second World War, a lot of the manuals regarding fieldcraft concealment and breaking up the outline of your helmet, all of that sort of thing, movement and so forth, a lot of it carries through into the Cold War, and obviously having a camouflage uniform makes that so much easier than having the plain green. But so there's quite big jumps. They happen quite rapidly because it is a change that's very desirable to happen, and obviously it happens in the British Army the Rhine fairly quickly. The same with protective gear, the MDC kit. It changes quite quickly because it's perceived to be a very high threat, and therefore it's one of the few times you'll see things in peacetime move quickly is when it's a major change that seems to be very beneficial. Although obviously the army always finds ways of using up old stock in other ways for training and so forth. So, but yeah, from a frontline point of view, the changes are quite noticeable going through, and fairly abrupt as well. The changes are fairly abrupt.
Yeah, there's not a slow phase out. Yeah.
As I say, the thing with battle dress is battle dress goes from just being being a field garment and worn, as a number 2 uniform essentially as well, to just being worn as number 2s, and then number 2 uniform comes in. So the transition occurs with it being an out of the field uniform, worn on the parade or whatever, barracks. That's where the slow transition takes place. The stuff in the field happens a lot more quickly. Yes,
it's cycled back into less critical roles, but still exists. Yeah.
Or maintained in that role.
Yeah.
Because you see people in the late 60s still wearing battle dress, even though number 2 uniform, the new service dress with the shirt and tie and everything had been introduced by that point. You still see battle dress worn quite a lot. So, yeah, there's more of a transition there than there is in the field. In the field, it tends to be quite. This is the new kit. We'll get it out to the troops as quickly as we can.
As soon as possible. Yeah.
But then again, as people have said, is if you look at the Falklands, a lot of kit which had been developed but wasn't seen as absolutely necessary was sort of held back, and accounts of people going, where's all this kit coming from? The stores have thrown their doors open and all this stuff's being thrown at people, and we didn't know we had half this stuff. So it depends on exactly what's going on at the time, I think, as regards how quickly new kit is actually dished out to people. There's the old adage, stores are for storing things, that's...
and then forgetting about them.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Excellent.
As I say, in terms of Soviet, I know you saying they hang on to uniforms and so on as well. Something you might know of, and I don't, if you don't, by all means just say, but in terms of weapons and so forth, they come up with the AK quite early on. In fact, a lot earlier than a lot of people think in some instances or realise. I don't know in terms of how quickly it was issued out and so forth. At what point can you say it becomes sort of the standard small arm? I mean, I know there's a transition with the SKS and things.
Yeah.
When can you expect to see it, sort of everyone armed with some manner of AK?
Some manner of AK. Okay, so without getting too deep into it, there was some big problems with the AK. The AK was originally designed to be built as a stamped gun.
Yes.
For ease of mass production, just stamp the receivers out, off you go. The factories that were set up to do that was implemented in, had trouble with it, so they had to switch to a milled receiver.
Yes. Which
is much more labour intensive, heavier, all that sort of thing. So the distribution was slower than they wanted, which is why the SKS hung around for.
Yes.
It was supposed to be phased out quite quickly, and everybody'd have this fancy new assault rifle. I can't give you an exact date, but it's sort of the middle of the 50s before really widespread adoption. When in 1959 they move over to the AKM,
that speeds things up.
Yeah,
quite a lot.
By that point, they've got the stamping sorted. There's a few minor tweaks, adjustments to the ergonomics and the operating system, but nothing major. And that then becomes, when most people say AK, they generally mean the AKM. Yeah, and from 59 onwards, pretty much everybody who isn't carrying a specialized weapon, you know, a GPNG, RPG, marksman's rifle, has an AKM.
Yeah.
And
So
everything else either falls out of service or is covered in grease, stuck in a barrel, and put in the back of a warehouse somewhere in case the big war ever happens.
Yeah, exactly. And you desperately need to arm
everybody and his brother.
Yeah. Yes. The factory militias.
Everybody, absolutely everybody. But yeah, about the mid to late 50s, coming up to the adoption of the AKM, most certainly frontline and a lot of the rear echelon troops are carrying AKs in some variation. Yeah.
It's interesting, as you say, is obviously the move to the milled gun and everything that is going to put a huge strain on procurement of them, and it's interesting that obviously, as you say, it's when they get round to actually having a simplified version that they can mass produce. That's when you see basically everything with them, sort of thing.
It was in mass production. There's the AK. I think there are 4. They're not known as. They're not officially recognised as. No. It's not like the AK-47 A, B, C, and D. Yeah. But there are 4 variations. Like I said, there's the original stamped one, which was produced in very small numbers because they realised we're really struggling with this. There's 2 variations of milled ones in the early 50s, and then there's I'm pretty sure the 4th version is when they start to get the stamping right, and the factories are kind of like, okay, we can do this now.
Right.
And that exists for a short period, and then, as I say, they tweak it, get the AKM, and just roll with that for the rest of up until early 70s.
Yes. It's the typical Soviet way: find something that works, and then just mass produce the heck out of it. Yeah.
I mean, it's doctrinally, it's interesting because most Western armies at this point were using battle rifles still.
Yes, absolutely.
You have the FAL in its various variations, the G3 and the M40, and then later on you move to the smaller high impulse cartridges.
I was going to say that's somewhat predicated on the fact that the US decided that they wanted 7.62 as the NATO.
Yeah.
It's a little complicated than that, but it's basically because of the high power of the NATO standard cartridge.
And swindled us out of a really fancy looking gun.
Yes,
never mind.
Yeah, really futuristic looking weapon system that we could have had. That's all water under the bridge. I'm not bitter about that at all.
Not even a little bit.
And then obviously the introduction of the major introduction of the intermediate cartridge in Vietnam, of course, with the M16. So it's interesting that it takes that situation. The introduction of the M16 to push that through, when, as you say, there were weapons around earlier on which would have taken intermediate cartridge very happily, and they didn't go for them.
I think it's an interesting doctrinal thing to note that all of these, most of the NATO armies were holding on to, full power cartridge battle rifles, and I think it's
there is the argument that the M14 was, of course, full auto, and the US argued it could be I've seen a lot of argument made that it could be fired full auto, no problem, and that picking out big chaps who could handle it in order to demonstrate that.
Maybe if you're the Hulk, but no, I don't think so.
It's not a practical full auto weapon to fire from the shoulder, certainly.
I mean, I've heard an apocryphal story from the Falklands that our forces, British forces, I should say, were armed with the SLR, Imperial Standard
Imperial FAL,
FAL. And the Argentine forces were armed with the metric FAL, which still had a loud switch.
Yes.
And the difference between accuracy and, effectiveness of fire, because the Argentine forces were using automatic fire and hitting not a lot, whereas the British forces were restricted to more accurate, more aiming intensive semi-automatic fire. That's apocryphal, but that's what I've heard.
Not something I can speak on myself, obviously, but not having served in the military myself, but I've seen articles discussing this fairly recently, of arguments being made of, should we go back to a more powerful battle rifle for the current sort of engagements that we're involved in, where you really need to drop somebody, in an environment where you might have someone coming up to a checkpoint at high speed on a vehicle or whatever, who could have an explosive strapped to them, for example, or is running at you with an explosive strapped to them. You need to drop them there and then. The thing is, that's kind of the arguments I've seen made, or the idea 5.56 won't do that, which in terms of ballistics and so forth, I can't comment on that. It's not my area of interest. It's just interesting to see that point is being argued.
I mean, It's that big doctrinal change. At the end of the Second World War, everything's becoming more mechanized, and there's a realization that, oh, guys aren't standing 1,000 yards apart in lines. We're moving around. There's bases of fire. And so everybody starts looking at automatic weaponry, and then they realize submachine guns are good. They're not really powerful enough or long enough ranged for. And then the assault rifle, the AK, for example.
Absolutely.
And then, like I say, NATO holds on to these full power rifles. But the Soviet doctrine, with it being heavily mechanized, there's not so much of a need for as long a range of firepower. No. The idea is the guys are in the carriers, the tanks roll over everything, the carriers come in, and the guys get out and mop up. So you don't need to be firing out to 800.
No.
1,000 yards, 400 yards.
Long range fire comes from the heavy machine guns and the main weapons on the vehicles.
On the vehicles. Yeah. I mean, all the squads have specialized weapons for longer range, but that more modern shift, I think that comes with the change in theatre as well. I mean, out in the middle, a lot of combat now, not the entirety, but a lot of combat is Middle East centric, and it's obviously desert, more arid, more open land, not as urbanized.
Yes.
And there's a lot of fighting between compounds, and ballistically, I mean, I'm not saying you want to get shot with anything, but 5.56 isn't perhaps the greatest man stopper in the universe.
No, if you're, and I suppose it's true as well, if you're fighting from a compound or a defensive position and you do have a wide open field of fire in front of you, then something with long reaches, you can reach out and touch people before they're very close to you is a good idea.
On the other hand, you don't want to take it to the extreme where, everybody's carrying marksman's rifles. No. And then when it does get in too close, there's this whole juggling act. You've got all sorts of weird cartridges coming out at the minute to sort of fulfill both niches.
It's interesting that the debate came round, as I say, that sort of this shift for the West, I suppose, in the 60s. No, not for us, but for the US, and into the 70s with the M16, and then it's interesting how long it took a lot of countries to actually come round to the assault rifle. If you look how long the SLR or indeed the FAL in semi-auto lasted in a lot of countries. And a full power cartridge, how long it took a lot of countries to actually transfer, after the US had, to then other countries transfer over to an intermediate cartridge. It's quite interesting, really. As you say, a lot of countries went right the way through the Cold War with a full power battle rifle.
Absolutely.
Britain included, essentially. If you, the SA-80, the FAL.
Talk about that.
Excuse me, the SLR, the L1A1 did see service, of course, right through the end, even if not with frontline troops. So you still see them in the Gulf in 91. So they're still around. They were still around, just not with frontline by that point. But
another interesting sort of little side branch on this is the German angle, because the Germans after the war, obviously military wasn't using, and then when they started the Bundeswehr, were obviously initially issued with FALs and then moved on to the G3, and they held on to the G3, and they were looking at replacing, and the replacement was this, I don't know if you ever heard it, you must have heard of it, the G11.
Yes.
Fantastic ray gun looking, caseless, clockwork
ammunition,
monster.
Absolutely. 3 rounds before the recoil hits your shoulder or something like that,
Cyclic rate in burst mode of 2,200 rounds per minute, which is just mental. And that was going to be their fantastic, all singing, all dancing, futuristic replacement. And then the Cold War ended, and everybody said, right, we don't need that anymore. Cut the budgets. So the Germans are stuck with G3s, or we can sort of use what the Americans are using, and then they switched to the G36, which is a fantastic rifle, but far more mundane than this space machine clockwork monster they were building.
Yes. It does look, as you say, it looks like something out of...
it's fantastic. It
looks like something out of Aliens.
Yeah. And speaking of weird guns, it's a little bit tangential, but this is...
it's absolutely fine. That's what this is for. Chatting about stuff.
Have to bring this up. Everybody knows the AK. The AK is the Soviet rifle.
Yes.
They did some really bizarre things with bullpup guns in the late 50s and early 60s.
With the sort of polymer receivers and everything as well.
Bakelite, fish-looking things with magazines at the very extreme end of the gun.
And the grip right at the muzzle, barely shooting beyond the foregrip. Yeah.
The entire length of the gun is encapsulated within about 600 millimeters. A guy called, I think the guy who was designing a lot of this strange and wonderful stuff was called German Koborov. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but his his mind was going to unusual places in the 1960s.
Yes.
But, you know,
it's very interesting. They fit well with the aesthetic of the time period, shall we say, in terms of
they're all
both sides.
The
space age, they fit quite nicely with that.
Absolutely.
The rockets with curvy fins and all that sort of thing.
Little Raypunk Gothic, yeah.
Of
course, I'm assuming the Soviets didn't have the excuse that the Americans have, that they were imbibing lots of LSD.
Well, no. Presumably not. If it was the case, I don't think we'd ever hear about that potentially.
Oh no, there's no drugs in the Soviet Union, comrade.
No drugs in the Soviet Union. No. Well, interesting one. Lucy is quite interested in criminal psychology.
Okay.
And This does link in, I assure you. There was an interesting case of a chap in the police towards the end of the Soviet Union. Trying to track down a serial killer, and he was having all these problems because the local police departments, obviously all one thing, but the local sort of chiefs and stuff. Well, no, there is no there is no such thing as a serial killer in the Soviet Union. They don't exist, and that he was massively hamstrung in his attempt to catch this guy because of doctrine.
The worst thing is,
this was a decadent Western thing that only happened in Western countries with their problems. It doesn't happen over here.
And I bet you so many of those guys knew. Yeah, we know he exists. We really wish we could help you,
but there's someone breathing down our neck.
Yeah. There's a man in a fancy suit with a very neat moustache who's
yes
probably going to unscrew our heads if we say he exists.
Yeah. Oh dear, crazy.
That's exaggeration, but yeah, it's
absolutely. The tropes are all there, but as I say, there is an element of truth behind it, certainly in some instances. So another question for you. This might be a difficult one to answer, but I'll be interested to hear your answer.
Okay.
Favorite most interesting to you decade of the Cold War? Do you have a preference? Do you have a particular decade that draws your attention more than the others?
Tricky. I'm going to say, tentatively, I like the 80s from an aesthetic point of view. 70s. I'm going to say 70s. You've got the transition into the M69 and the M73 uniforms. You've got the adoption of the AK-74. You've got all the fancy chemical warfare gear starts to come of age. You've got the development of some of the really fancy armoured vehicles.
Yes.
I think in terms of fluidity, the 70s. I'm going to say the 70s. I'm going to go with the 70s.
Excellent. I like the reasoning as well.
A lot goes on in the 70s.
Absolutely so. Yeah. Well, I make the same from a Western point of view. I make the same argument for the 60s, which is my sort of the one I find the most interesting. But that's it is a difficult one because, as you say, I find there are interesting elements right the way through the Cold War. Obviously, it was never ending what was going on. Even during periods of so-called détente and everything, that the actual developments the 70s, obviously, what was actually going on in terms of developments and so forth are nevertheless fascinating. So it is a difficult one to answer, but I go with the 60s personally. But,
I think just thinking about it and sort of spitballing the idea, in the 60s, the Soviet Union, I think, is far more concentrating on the space race.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And that you've got Yuri Gagarin goes into space, and then the Soviets put lunar rovers on the moon, and then they sort of quote unquote lose the space race because the Americans put Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and so forth on the moon. And then I sometimes wonder whether the Soviets just sort of go, pack it up, we've lost this one. Let's put the funding somewhere else, and that then opens up all this military stuff that's been sat waiting. Maybe.
Possibly so. My understanding of it is it's the shift from Khrushchev to Brezhnev.
Yes.
Brezhnev. And this is my understanding. I'm not a student of military history in a formal sense in this regard. This is what I've picked up from my own interest. In that Brezhnev is a lot more obviously it's a lot more conservative administration comes in, and their idea is we've been blustering through the 60s. We've been our missile technology is not as good as we think it is, although it was very good, of course. By the end of the 60s, our military power, we say we have these things, we don't have them. We need to actually knuckle down and build some real military power here. And I think that's one of the reasons you see a shift to more building up obviously there's still a massive push for new technology and so forth. There's a lot of consolidation of existing technology, and more incremental improvement in the 70s than revolutionary improvement, which you'd seen in, or attempts at revolutionary improvement that you'd seen in the 60s. I think that's fair to say, on average. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to that rule.
I think that's a good angle, to be honest.
Partly due to the mentality of the senior leadership, because if you look at some of the crazy things that Khrushchev was pushing in terms of, and was interested in terms of military technology and so forth. The Ukraine plan is a good example of that, and then obviously you then get a more conservative take on it in the 70s and so on. I would argue that side. I think that's the reason why you see that change and shift in the 70s.
You talk about Khrushchev pushing for strange things. I'm sure we all know at the end of the Second World War, the big Soviet tanks that rolled down Berlin, and everybody went, "Oh no, they've got giant tanks now." He actually wasn't a huge fan of those. I'm not sure whether it had something to do with his relation with Stalin, and Stalin's tanks were his. So he had this huge obsession with guided missiles, and at the start of the 60s, wire-guided command line of sight missiles, big thing. So no, get rid of these heavy tanks that we've just spent billions upon billions developing. I want guided missile tanks, and they build guided missile tanks, and they're terrible, and they have to sort of go, let's go back to the normal tanks. I think
there was definitely missile fever in the 60s, not only in the USSR. Obviously, you have things like the Sheridan, where there is this idea, and you've got obviously the Navy. You shift away from guns to guided missiles, guided destroyers, and everything. The missile age, which of course comes back around to bite the RN in the Falklands, where you don't have a close-in anti-aircraft defence in terms of medium anti-aircraft guns like the Bofors and small anti-aircraft guns like the 20mm Oerlikons.
And these are in the years before phalanx guns and things.
So the focus on the focus on missiles actually is somewhat detrimental, as you say, with in tank design, where actually a reliable gun. I think there were some thinkers who thought there would be a complete shift to rocket artillery and all sorts of things, as opposed to having guns. But guns are just so much more efficient in terms of lobbing large quantities of accurate firepower. Obviously, you can use rocket batteries, unguided rocket batteries, to saturate an area. But if you want accurate, heavy firepower, rapid firepower that's cost effective, then an artillery shell fired from an accurate piece is far more
fairly hard to beat.
It's far more cost effective than a complex guided missile.
Absolutely. Takes far less time to set up.
Where you're blowing up all the computer system and guidance system, as well as the actual explosive, where at least the case and everything, all you chuck out of a gun is the explosive bit in a container, whereas obviously it's more cost effective. So I don't know, it is an odd one. The mania with missiles, I think, was just symptomatic of the technology of that time. People were very focused on the high technology and everything else. But it's interesting to hear that they're actually building guided missile tanks in the USSR as well. It's not something across.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic looking machine. I think it's called the IT-1, Israeli Tank 1. It looks like a very squashed Soviet tank. The distinctive dome turret. It's like somebody's put their hand on the top of it and just gone squash.
Yes.
And then taken the gun off. And in transport mode, it looks like it doesn't appear to have any external weaponry. And then when it gets into combat, a little hatch opens and a missile just flicks out from inside. The fins pop out, and it's amazing. It's such a Transformers looking thing. It's brilliant.
Yeah, but not effective.
Not great. No, it looks great. Isn't great. Speaking of advanced technology and good ideas gone bad, there's an interesting parallel between British forces and the Soviet forces in the 60s. Both armies design a super tank, or a new main battle tank.
Indeed, so
the British design the Chieftain, which is huge and powerful and can sit in an embrasure for days and just fight off hordes of tanks. The Soviets build the T-64, which is fast and agile and has a massive gun. And they're both powered by opposed piston. Chieftain is vertical. The T-64 is horizontal. Opposed piston engines, 2-stroke opposed piston engines, which sound amazing, but both suffer from exactly the same reliability issues. And both armies then have to spend nearly a decade going, we've got these amazing tanks, and they're being let down by the engines, and
Yeah.
just fighting fires to get the engines working right.
Yeah.
Often literally.
Fascinating. Well, at least the idea was the chieftain had to move less.
Yeah.
That's the only thing you could say from that pairing is
we can just sit here all day. The other guys have got to move. We'll make them come to us. So, but yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I hadn't thought of that. It's an interesting parallel. It is an interesting parallel.
And the only thing I can think of is I believe both engines in their own way were derived from German aero engines from the Second World War.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which then sticks with the whole idea of us, capturing technology and scientific teams from.
Well, the idea is to get high horsepower, low weight.
Yes.
I would imagine, but you're not. Obviously, reliability is really paramount when it comes to vehicle engines due to the strain they're under. So. I mean,
the Soviet one in particular, with it being a horizontal engine, it's very flat. So you've not got this whole. You don't need the back of the tank to be massively high to fit the block in.
Of course, it's a nice flat pack engine.
Slides in, low tank, low profile, and then of course that fits with the Soviet doctrine.
The Soviets chose tank crew, certainly for some of their tanks, to be of diminutive stature to fit more. Or is that an urban legend?
That's an interesting one, and I totally know what you're on about. It's never been formally acknowledged. And it does sort of have that urban myth sort of angle to it, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
If you're able to direct your conscripts wherever you want them, then you would have thought they'd maybe direct the short guys into
the tanks. There's the long-standing trope is that the Soviets really don't care about ergonomics all that much, and in a way, yes, they're trying to do a lot of stuff whilst also keeping the vehicles very small. Another really good example is the BMP, the personnel carriers, which have which have economized space so much in order to get a comparatively massive number of troops, a gun, secondary weaponry, and the vehicle's crew and engine. Yeah. The only place left for the fuel tanks is the rear doors.
Rear doors, yes. Yeah.
And then in Afghanistan, very often, so the stories go, repurpose one of those doors to brew hooch.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that would
empty the tank out and because we're not moving as much.
Bit of diesel in there, anyway, it'd be fine.
It's fine. To be perfectly honest, the stuff they're drinking, you could probably get away with drinking diesel and come out of it feeling slightly better.
I think once you've probably brewed one load of hooch in there, it would clean it out quite nicely.
It certainly stripped the paint off.
That's brilliant. I like stories like that. That's excellent.
The other little apocryphal story on the same note is the guys who serviced the MiGs suddenly became everybody's best friend.
Yes, indeed. The
radars were alcohol cooled.
The Foxbat, the MiG-20.
Not necessarily. The Foxbat is a very, very amazing plane.
It is.
But it was more the ground attack jets. The Foxbat.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
Being an interceptor was really kept for sort of homeland defence.
Yes. Sorry. In Afghanistan, you mean?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
I understand.
The ground attack MiGs. It's more Sukhois and Tupolevs and. Yes. But the guys who serviced the radars were everybody's best friend because the radars were alcohol cooled. So when it came time to drain the alcohol out, it'd be put in a barrel and the barrel would disappear.
Fresh alcohol in, the old mucky alcohol that's been going around the system drained out, but that's okay.
And when we say alcohol, it's just alcohol. So the sort of stuff that makes you really drunk for about half an hour and then blind.
Yes, indeed.
But there we go.
That's an excellent story. Both of those, in fact, brewing hooch as well. I love it.
Again, there's that apocryphal edge to them, and I don't want to say, these are gospel. This is exactly how it was. But
of course,
they do the rounds often enough that you have to give them some sort of credence.
I think even if it is just a good story, as long as you take it with the grain of salt that you've given there, saying it's the apocryphal story, and it's something that's been spread around, you can still enjoy it as a story, the idea of it, even if you don't give it absolute full credence as being true. That's yes, it is interesting how that sort of thing often happens in a particularly inhospitable, unpopular war zone. Yes, that's a good way of saying it, an unpopular war zone, how that these little ways of getting around the system evolve. And
again, it draws interesting parallels with the Americans in Vietnam, drafted soldiers, and
with drug use and so forth.
Apocryphal drug use. We've all seen. It's Platoon, isn't it?
The statistics do bear that out, unfortunately, in the number of men who were hospitalised and so forth, and had to go through, you know, come on, Simon, what's the word I'm looking for? Who had to go through a period of cold turkey and everything with supervision to get off the drugs, and obviously the offers that were made to allow men to come forward and say, I have a drug problem.
Yeah.
I need help, you know. So it's not so much apocryphal there. It is a real statistical problem that existed in the field, certainly in the 70s, towards the very end of American involvement. It was not a good situation at all.
No,
in the
absolutely
military,
not.
The discipline falling down in that regard. It did not bode well. But yes, as you say, in an unpopular war zone, when I mean, you watch some documentaries on Vietnam, and where chaps are saying you could buy anti-war literature in Vietnam from street vendors. They were selling books written in the US.
But how much of that is sort of I don't want to use the too fancy black ops. You know, these street vendors maybe had ties to you know, North Vietnamese political organisations, and were sort of getting the literature slipped in. They did just leave it on the counter there.
Possibly so. I've not something I've read of. The suspicions of that, but it's an interesting idea, certainly. Because it would make perfect sense. It would be an ideal thing to do.
Anything to chip away.
Erode morale, absolutely. And you know, especially if you know the men who are coming over have already had, you know, some of them have already had the seed sown in their mind of what the situation is. So it's a fascinating thing to look at that human aspect of it, I suppose, in both the US forces and in Soviet forces in Afghanistan. I mean, it's interesting as well to see that you also get the sort of special operations, the higher morale units, the more professional units. There's a parallel there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're building up their own identity and esprit de corps and everything. The odd uniform choices and things like that is an interesting one. Gucci bits of kit and stuff.
Absolutely, the really fancy, you know, prototype bits of equipment that they get.
Yes.
Soviet example, perfect example, is the Altin helmets. You know, which, you know, are just mimetic. Well, the derivatives of those helmets are just mimetic on the internet nowadays.
Yes.
We've all seen the Masker helmets with the big armored visors. Their genesis comes in the early 80s when Europe, in the aftermath of things like the Munich incident in Germany, you know, Europe suddenly looking, we need sort of high flexibility counter-terror teams, and the Soviets looking at the same thing and going, yeah, so do we actually. And then you get the genesis of Spetsnaz units like Alpha, who need all this fancy gear. And interestingly enough, the original, prior to the Soviet helmets, Alpha just flat out bought a set of helmets from Switzerland.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which were also used by GSG-9, the German unit, the German counter-terror unit. The Soviets at this point didn't have titanium stamping technology needed to make the helmet shells.
So they just bought them.
They just bought them from Switzerland. Switzerland were neutral operators at this point. Your money's as good as anybody's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have some crash helmets.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's just like I say, and at GSG-9,
it always drives the evolution of kit. That sort of operation, I think, it's always going to drive the evolution and development of new specialised kit for units like that. Obviously, if they're actually in the field doing stuff. That's when, you know, stuff tends to move forward a bit, I think, in terms of
necessity is the mother of invention and all that.
Yeah, specialised kit of that nature. It's all very interesting stuff. Yes, well, it's been really good chatting to you, Matt.
Yes, and
we've
you.
covered quite a lot of ground there, all over the place. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet up at Hat Green in the autumn. Hopefully by then there'll be a situation where the event can take place. But if not, it's been great chatting to you here, and we might have to do this again if it looks like it. That's not going.
And to you, it's been a great idea. It's been great fun just to waffle for a bit. I really appreciate the chance to come on and chat to you. Yeah,
no worries. It's been great chatting to you as well. And it's fascinating to hear bits about stuff that obviously I don't really know a huge amount about Soviet kit and so forth.
Likewise.
It's very interesting to hear about that side of things. So thank you very much once again.
No problem at all.
Excellent. I'll say goodbye for now, and I'll say we'll have to do this again at some point, particularly if events aren't going forward. But hopefully, fingers crossed,
we can hope.
Be on in the autumn.
We can hope.
See. Nice one. Really good chatting to you, Matt. Bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.